arriving, if that's the right word, on Zoom. But I'm keen to start. We've got about 55 minutes and a lot to get through. Firstly, let me say thank you so much to the New Statesman for hosting this. You can tweet them at NS Live Events. The hashtag for this and their other events is at NS Labour Conference, all one word. Secondly, let me thank Hilary Benn for agreeing to do this. You all know who Hilary is. He's the MP for Leeds Central, and he has been, I think, since 1999 when he won a by-election there. He was, I think, in the cabinet under Blair and Brown, was Shadow Foreign Secretary under Ed Miliband, and since, I think, this is from memory because I forgot to write it down, October 2016?
Yep.
Chair of the, it's a bit sad that I know that, chair of the Exiting the EU Committee in the House of Commons. The way I propose to do this is, I mean, I've got a whole load of questions to ask Hilary, and ranging from Brexit to current politics, the state of the Labour Party and so on. I'll keep my eye out on the chat, and if there are things that come in that sort of fit into where we are, I might fit them in, but I won't do it any more formally than that. But if we can kick off, Hilary, we might as well kick off with Brexit and where we are. And
sure.
Given what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, how likely do you think there's going to be a Brexit deal?
I think there is going to be a deal because it would be completely inexplicable if the two sides failed to reach agreement on one. It may be very thin, it maybe just avoids tariffs between ourselves and the EU and the other way, because it makes sense for there to be one. And in the context of the economic crisis caused by COVID, why would you wish to add the cost of charging tariffs and all of the complications that would come to that? There's a lot of sound and fury at the moment, which I think is more about trying to leverage negotiating advantage rather than a prelude to saying the thing has been a disaster and we haven't been able to reach agreement and that's it. It is inexplicable that the Prime Minister described no agreement as a good outcome, because the more I hear from those who would be affected by no agreement, tariffs, tariff rate quotas, rules of origin and so on, nobody could describe that as a good outcome for the country. And the second thing I would say is whether there's an agreement or not, and we need to remember this, and it was the point that Michael Gove was talking about in the House yesterday, because we're leaving the customs union, the single market structure at the end of this year, there are going to be big changes in the way in which goods move. There's going to be extra paperwork, bureaucracy, red tape and cost for businesses, which is going to have an impact. And there is the potential for queues at Dover if lorries arrive without the right paperwork. But a lot of them will say, well, if the IT systems aren't ready, then you're going to have a problem.
You're not one of those, I mean, you sort of laid out the practicalities of this. So there is a strain of thought that would argue that this is a government that isn't sort of ruled by practicalities. In fact, it's a vote leave government that actually, you know, takes its strength from getting into fights with people, and that there are some people in this administration who actively want no deal. But you actually think that the Prime Minister has a preference for a deal?
Well, how, as Prime Minister of this country, would you stand up and say to British farmers, I'm really sorry, but you're going to be facing tariffs of 30-40%, even more, to export your goods to Europe? What would that do to the lamb industry? To say to motor manufacturers in Britain, and we've seen the warnings that Nissan have made, yep, there's going to be an extra 10% on the cost of the just under 2,000 cars a day we sell to the European Union. How would you explain that away? And remember, we were promised a great deal. We were promised in the midst of time, one of the easiest trade deals in history, exact same benefits and all of those things. Well, it wasn't true, because what they're negotiating at the moment is the first trade deal in history that will result in worse terms for one of the parties, namely the United Kingdom.
Okay, I want to come back to what a deal will be. Actually, there's a couple of people who have written in about subsidies. I wasn't going to dig into this, but I will. I mean, how, well, firstly, leave aside the sort of the complete irony that a Conservative government might fail to sign a deal because it wants to give out large amounts of state aid, which is curious to say the least. But how would you see an agreement being reached on state aid? Because it seems to me at the moment, the positions of both sides are fairly, well, very incompatible.
Well, firstly, it would help enormously if the government set out what its state aid policy is. Michael Gove told our select committee in March we're working on this, and the EU has moved. It's changed from saying you must follow our regime, which was never going to be a runner, to now rather plaintively asking the government, would you be so kind as just to give us a hint as to what it is you're planning to follow in the way of rules? And actually, the government doing that would both help with the problem of Article 10 and in the language reach back of state aid rules, not just applying to Northern Ireland, but to the rest of the United Kingdom, and would enable progress to be made. But in the absence of that, I've been arguing for several months, the EU should say to the UK, all right, we know you're aligned with our rules at the moment, and as long as you maintain aligned, and as long as you don't subsidize your industries in a way which we think is anti-competitive or gives you an unfair advantage, we will give you this degree of access. If you do, however, move away from that, we reserve the right to reduce it, either by saying we can't do this anymore, or we're going to put tariffs on some of your products. Now, I've christened that a grand equivalence arrangement because the EU is familiar with equivalence arrangements where they do that with financial services, for example. It's not the most stable setup, but it is a way of observing the red lines of both of the parties. And in the report that we produced at the Select Committee in the summer, we did say that both sides are going to have to move. That's how you get an agreement in the end, compromise on both sides. And instead of posturing and shouting at each other and briefing against each other and threatening, frankly, they should get back to their day job, which is negotiating a deal which is in everybody's interests.
Okay, I mean, actually, this is a slightly sort of left field question, but it's a conversation that a few of us were having the other day because we're such wacky people, which is, how does, I don't know if you could think back, how does where we're at now in terms of Brexit compare with what your expectations were on the 24th of June 2016? That's to say, back then, what did you expect Brexit to mean?
Well, it's a very, very good question because, of course, people who voted for Brexit had many different ideas as to what it meant. And a lesson for the future is, if you're going to have a referendum like this, we need to be clear about what it is people are voting for, because you and I have met people who've said, I don't want anything to do with the EU. I'm perfectly happy to trade on WTO terms. I'll take any economic damage because it's about our sovereignty. A question in the modern world, the issue about sovereignty is what do you do with it? And the fact is we share it with others for our mutual benefit. And if you take the well-used analogy of buying a house, you put in an offer because you'd like living there, but the year then get a survey done and you find out what exactly it is that you're buying. And if you do that with a house purchase, in hindsight, wouldn't that have been very sensible thing to do with Brexit? But we're certainly heading for a much harder Brexit than I thought would be the case immediately after the referendum result.
Okay, if assuming there is a deal, one of the things that intrigues me is Labour going to be able to effectively hold the government to account for getting what will only be a very, very thin deal? It seems to me that the whole debate now is so polarised around the danger of no deal that Boris Johnson might be able to pull off the same trick he pulled off last year. That's to say, sign a deal, even though he was signing a deal that Theresa May had said no British Prime Minister could ever accept, but being greeted like a conquering hero because he'd managed to get it. Do you think in the event there is a deal, there is politically the space and the opportunity for Labour to launch an effective critique? Or do you think the public at large will think, well, he's got a deal, stop going on about it?
Well, that's part of the reason, apart from my natural optimism, that I answered your first question by saying I think he will get a deal.
Yeah.
Because if he does, he will want to say all of you who doubted my ability to get a deal were wrong once again. So yes, I think it's fairly clear that that is what he will do. But the thinness of that deal will become apparent over time. And I think the answer to your question is one of timing. Because as the 1st of January arrives and we see what the practical impact on the border is of decisions taken previously, which are very largely not to do with any agreement reached, and also as sectors of the economy discover that things that they used to be able to do, they can't do anymore because it hasn't been included in the thin deal that has been reached. And I would expect that there will be a continuation of negotiations on other questions. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we do get a deal as a country, because not having one would leave a sour taste in everybody's mouth. And I want the closest possible pragmatic, practical relationship with our friends and neighbours and our biggest trading partners after the 31st of December as possible. And I think there will be a continuation of negotiation for quite a period of time.
I mean, talking of that, I suppose it leads on. Tony Azzarelli's written in and said, should the Labour Party have a position on rejoining?
No, because I think the matter has been settled now. 20, 30 years time, who knows? Who knows what the EU is going to look like? I think the EU is going to have to reform itself. Because when we argued for Remain in the referendum, certainly when I did, it was not because I thought the EU was in a state of constitutional perfection. The truth is that the two great political forces at work in the world at the moment, on the one hand, is the cry for devolution, for sovereignty, for greater control, because this is a way in which communities and countries feel that they can try and influence what's happening in a world where a lot of people wake up in the morning and say, I don't have any control at all about what is occurring in my life and my community and in my workplace. On the other hand, the necessity for international collaboration is more clear than at any time previously in human history. Because if you think of the great challenges we face, dangerous climate change, the damage that we are doing to the environment, the consequences of a conflict and the refugees that flow from that, the search of people for a better life, because the three motivations for moving: search for a better life, fleeing conflict. And if we don't tackle climate change, people are not going to stay to die of thirst or to drown where they're living today. They will move somewhere else in the hope of having a life tomorrow. And you can only deal with all of those things by working with other countries. Now, as ever in life and in politics, it's about the balance between the two.
Well, I mean, turn this on its head a bit. What is your biggest concern about if there's no deal?
The damage it will do to a relationship with our biggest trading partner, but it's the damage that it will do to sectors of the British economy. The government has admitted that, because when they did originally do economic assessments, they don't do that anymore because they know perfectly well what it will show. And you in the UK and a Changing Europe, you've just produced a new report on the consequences of no deal. It would be really bad for a number of companies and sectors and businesses and livelihoods and jobs. And that is on top of the economy facing the worst challenge that you and I and everyone watching have experienced in our lifetimes because of COVID. Now, why on earth would you want to add the consequences of a no deal, leaving of the transition period, to the great challenge that we've already got in front of us? And so, above all, I worry about the impact it's going to have on communities and people's lives.
Do you worry that the government might seek to ride out no deal by, if you like, mobilising the worst of our demons? That's to say, pointing the finger, blaming the foreigners, saying this is what they've done to us, and essentially exacerbating that leave remain divide that there is in our society. Do you think that could work as a strategy? Do you think the economic reality of it would catch up with them?
Well, of course, in those circumstances, and as I said, I don't think it will happen because it would not be a rational outcome. Of course, the government is going to blame the EU. And I think as far as the country is concerned, those who were in favour of Brexit would blame the EU too, and those who were against would blame the government. And that doesn't get us much further forward, but it is a choice. However, I would say that the EU has to recognise the result of the referendum. It has to recognise what sovereignty means. And insofar as it started out trying to bind us to European rules, the EU has had to come to recognise that that isn't going to work. Now, it's difficult, above all, because this is such a close trading relationship, and this is the first time the EU has had to negotiate with a member state that's left, and they're very, very worried about if too good a deal is achieved by the United Kingdom, that other EU countries might say, well, I think we'll leave, and can we have one of those deals you gave to Britain? So one has to understand the motivation on either side. But whoever is to blame, it would be a failure of politics, and it would be a failure of political leadership, particularly on the part of those who promised in the course of the referendum, we will get a great deal for this country. Well, deliver it.
What did you make? I mean, I put a touch on this, I suppose, because it was such big news yesterday. What do you make of the Kent border that we were talking about? Did that surprise you? Did it surprise you that the government was willing to talk about it so honestly, because it's quite clearly not an outcome of Brexit that we were led to expect by them?
Well, it is. I think somebody observed it's an irony that the government's negotiation of Brexit has ended up with a border in the Irish Sea and now a border around Kent. Well, that's going some. They had flagged up the idea of this Kent access permit previously. The reason is very simple. The government knows that if lorries that don't have the right paperwork arrive at Dover, there's going to be a problem, because they either won't be allowed to get on the ferries, or they'll be turned round by the French once I think it's 300 spaces they have created at Calais for non-compliant vehicles while the paperwork gets sorted out. And therefore, the government, to avoid the queues on the M20, is trying to say, can we intercept the lorries to make sure they've got the right paperwork before they come into Kent? Because they're also worried that the impact of those queues would have on just normal travelling in Kent, the ability of deliveries to get to supermarkets and fuel trucks to get to petrol stations and so on. The government realised that they weren't ready to deal with checks on goods coming into the country. That's why they announced the postponement of those. That's why they bought the field at Ashford. And there are two things they're going to do there. The first will be to try and check those lorries, if the Kent access permit, if people have got through the net, to make sure before they head to Dover they've got the right paperwork. And in due course, when we implement full checks on goods coming from the EU into the UK, there's no space at Dover to pull lorries aside and check them. So they'll be told to drive on to Ashford and park up while customs procedures are dealt with. And if anyone wants to know what that kind of thing looks like, have a look at the border between Sweden and Norway, or have a look at the border between the United States of America and Canada. Some people have said, oh, it's dead easy, but there's infrastructure, there's checks, there's drivers getting out of lorries, waving paperwork, getting cleared.
I should mention, if you didn't know, that Ladbrokes were yesterday offering odds on the next president of Kent, which...
Really? Well, now there we go.
Yeah, Nigel Farage was the shortest odds, I'm afraid. But just in terms of your constituency, your patch, and perhaps maybe the north of England more generally, do you see specific negative impacts of this for those regions? I mean, just...
Well, let's take a very practical example. Nissan in Washington. Now, this has been a huge investment. It provides a lot of well-paid jobs. It supports a lot of other jobs in the local economy, and the chief operating officer of Nissan was very clear, because now a trade deal has been signed between the UK and Japan. In due course, those companies might decide, well, we'll make all the cars in Japan and ship them over. So the thing about the United Kingdom, of course, is that we have been more successful than France and more successful in Germany in attracting foreign direct investment, which has created a lot of jobs, including in areas where our old industries have declined. I think that's the first point. The second point is that if this has an adverse economic impact, that's going to be felt by everybody, and that is on top of coronavirus. And my principal worry at the moment, because of the contacts and emails and letters I'm getting from constituents and companies, it's the effect that they could continuing existence of the virus and the restrictions are going to have on them, because there's a lot of people who, despite what the Chancellor has announced today, I think there's a lot of companies who will say, I'm sorry, I can't afford that proportion of the wages. If I've got no income coming in because our business can't operate, I'm not going to be able to keep on the workers. And that's why I think the government should have been much more targeted at those sectors, which is what we as a Labour opposition have been arguing for months.
Why do you think, actually, I won't preempt you, do you think, and if so, why, that businesses have been strangely reluctant to point the finger at Brexit as the reason for plant closures and the like? I've been struck by the reluctance of some firms to talk about Brexit and the dangers it poses to them out loud. I mean, the big organisations like the CBI have, but individual companies seem to me to be quite careful.
That is true, with one or two exceptions. Ford has been very open about the impact it will have on its supply chain. I think there are two reasons. One is, if you're listed on the stock exchange, it doesn't do wonders for your business to say we think we're going to be badly hit.
Yeah.
And secondly, businesses think long and hard before getting up the noses of the government of the day, not least when they are pressing the government of the day to give them help to deal with coronavirus. And that's why representative organisations have been much more able to speak out on behalf of their member companies. I don't think it's that the civil servants and ministers don't understand what the consequences are. It's just the government is now operating within these hard Brexit constraints, as we've moved from wanting an ambitious deal to, well, bare bones in some respects. This is the other myth, because the government says, well, we're only asking for what you've given to Canada and others. On trade and tariffs, that's broadly correct. But in other areas, the UK is asking for very ambitious things like mutual recognition of qualifications, an ability for workers to go in and deliver services in other European countries. And remember, of course, we've talked a lot about goods in the last 25 minutes, but the UK economy is 80% services.
We're also asking for more haulage licenses, which strangely enough, the Canadians didn't really spend much time talking about. But if we can move on just quickly to the internal market bill.
Yes.
I suppose the first question is, despite the changes the government has made in response to pressure from its own backbenchers, do you still think it is in breach of international law? Well,
yes, I do, but it doesn't matter what I think. Brandon Lewis got up in the House of Commons and said that, and there was, I think, there was a collective dropping of jaws right across the chamber, because I was in at the time when he said it. Yes, it does. And
even with the consultation of Parliament, they've agreed to.
Yeah, look, you can have a legal argument about whether the breaking of international law is, at the moment, you publish the legislation, you put it on the statute book, right the way through to the laying of the regulations. I think that's beside the point, because the damage has been done in terms of Britain's international reputation as a country that upholds agreements it negotiates and signs. I mean, this is the extraordinary thing about what the government has done. Boris Johnson negotiated and signed that agreement, and indeed the Attorney General who helped him to do it has now denounced what the government has done. But I think it is a negotiating tactic, because it's about what is happening in the joint committee, which is where these questions of GB Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland GB trade and state aid in part are being played out. And on the diversion of third country listing, I don't know how we got to that. I can conceive of no circumstances whatsoever, Anand, in which the EU will not list the United Kingdom as a third country for the purposes of agricultural exports. I mean, it's a nonsense. And the negotiators should get back to the negotiating and stop messing about with that.
I mean, what impact do you think this will have on the UK's international reputation? And does it, I mean, above and beyond the kind of hand-wringing, does it really matter? I mean, are we really saying that a hard-headed assessment of national interest, a state won't do business with us because we did this? Does it have a practical impact?
I think it does, because never in my life did I think I would watch a government minister stand up and say what we're proposing breaks international law. never happened before. That's the first point. The second point is that there is a mechanism in the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, which the government negotiated and signed, which is the place where these things can be dealt with. So if the government truly believes that the EU is acting in a way that damages the UK's interests, then it can take action. And then there's a dispute resolution procedure and arbitration. And I didn't get a satisfactory reply from the Prime Minister when I asked him at the liaison committee about why do you think the mechanism you yourself negotiated is insufficient to deal with the problems that you're concerned about. Now, I think there is, like all of these things, there is a sensible place to end up. On which goods are at risk. Well, most of the goods that go from GB into Northern Ireland are not at risk of entering the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the EU. Supermarket lorries full of stuff for the shelves of supermarkets in Belfast and Londonderry will only enter the EU in the boots of the cars of people who've driven over the border to do their weekly shop, and they'll end up in the fridge and the freezer. And that is not something that the EU needs to be concerned about. And as far as goods the other way, my own personal view is exit summary declarations in an electronic form you have to fill in to move the bus you made in Ballymena to a transport authority somewhere in the north of England. Why is the EU interested in that? Because what are they going to do with it? Are they going to put it in an electronic filing cabinet? It seems to be singularly pointless. On the other hand, announcing you're going to breach international law, is it really worth it for a little electronic form? So I think there should be a pragmatic solution to that as well. With goodwill, you can solve these problems.
I'm going to take your words out of context. I mean, in a sense, you're almost arguing that the internal market bill has worked, because by threatening this enormous sort of hand grenade, it might make the EU think, oh look, it's just an export declaration, let's just drop it. If the price, if the alternative is, you know, them blowing the whole thing up, including the withdrawal agreement, with all the consequences that might have for Ireland and Northern Ireland, why don't we just drop that idea?
Well, I think that's probably what the government intended, but I don't know, because I'm not party to their thinking. I'm just observing the way in which they're behaving and what they're doing. And I hope, as you'll have gathered, that a pragmatic solution can be reached. But it is a very, very serious step to take, and I do think it does damage. And after all, when every other living former Prime Minister, two former leaders of the Conservative Party, the Attorney General who helped you to negotiate the deal, the Democrat presidential candidate who may become the President of the United States in November, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and many others have things to say about this. You really ought to care about Britain's international reputation. And I think it was a very, very unwise thing to do.
You mentioned the liaison committee, and if I remember rightly, my memory's rubbish, so correct me if I've got this wrong, you also asked the Prime Minister if the EU was negotiating in good faith. Let me turn that on its head. Given the internal market bill, do you think the government is negotiating in good faith?
Look, I think both sides are deploying all the means they have at their disposal to try and lever a better outcome. This is what happens in negotiations. The thing about the question to the Prime Minister was, he said he didn't think they were negotiating in good faith. Brandon Lewis had earlier told the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee he thought they were negotiating in good faith. So the government appears to be in two minds about the EU's motivation. There's no doubt that the internal market bill has been quite a provocation to the other EU countries. But I really think one has to leave those things on one side, because if we get bound up in the weeds of what one side is saying to the other in public to try and lever a better position, you're missing the point. We're running out of time. There's a deal that needs to be done. Go back and make it happen. I apologize for repeating the point, but as the clock ticks by, we really, really need that to happen, because the consequences of not getting one, as we've discussed, are very, very considerable for many people and businesses in our country.
Mm. I mean, on the politics of this, I mean, we can get worked up about this.
Yeah.
Lawyers get worked up about it. I can't begin to express how worked up Catherine Barnard is about this sort of thing. Twitter gets worked up about it. Do you think the electorate care? I mean, do you think this is the sort of thing that ultimately will have no impact whatsoever on how the government is perceived? And therefore, it's not something trying to win political points on for the Labour Party?
Well, the government crudely thinks, well, this shows we're standing up for Britain. That's their motivation. Mm-hmm. And I think, although we've left the European Union, one does have to point that out sometimes to people who are still arguing the issue as if we haven't left. Mm-hmm. We have left. And we're coming out of the transition period in a very short space of time. So that is over, that is done. And the question is, what kind of future relationship are we going to have? And how can we have as close and as good a relationship as possible to our economic and other benefit? I think that's what we should focus on. The consequences, as I said earlier, of things that the consequences of leaving that then become apparent, well, may or may not change some people's minds about the way in which they voted. The polling evidence is there's been a bit of a shift, but that's over and done with now. We lost the referendum, and we're having now to deal with the consequences, and we've got to make the best of the situation we find ourselves in, because that's what the electorate decided.
We touched a little bit on sort of Britain's international reputation. Yeah. And one of the things that struck me about the whole Brexit process is how parochial it's been, in a sense, that we've spent a lot of time talking about trade and tariffs, but we've not actually thought about the big picture, about geopolitics, about the world we're living in, about the degree to which, and this is a criticism as much of the European Union's negotiating stance as of ours, in a sense, that do you think that we've missed a trick by not focusing on the big picture? That's to say, in 5 years' time, we're going to have to learn to work together in a world that's ever more uncertain. Do you get that sense that we've been too narrow?
Well, I do. And one of my arguments against Brexit was, I said I thought it would weaken Britain's influence in the world. And it comes back to the point I was making about sovereignty. I can make you sovereign, Anand. I can bolt the door that I can see behind you, and you're in the room on your own. And in that room, you are sovereign. You can do whatever you like. No one else can tell you what to do. Question.
If only that were true.
Well, question. Where does it get? Where does it get you? And the answer is, it gets you nowhere, because the issues come up. There are great challenges. We've talked about those earlier that we need to solve. And our relationship, political as well as economic, with the European Union has been one very important one. And we've given that up. That's the decision that has been made in the referendum. Now, we're still members of the UN Security Council and so on. But it means that if other parts of the world want to talk to Europe, they are not going to be picking up the phone to the United Kingdom. And I don't think it sends a message about global Britain, which is what the government claims. I think it damages it myself. And secondly, to take another decision of the government, the abolition of the Department for International Development. Now, I have a particular interest in this, having been the Secretary of State for nearly 4 years, and I work with extraordinary, passionate, committed, able civil servants. And DFID established a huge reputation around the world for the quality of its thinking, its policy, its funding, its leadership. What we achieved in the last Labour government on debt relief and increases in aid, some countries honoured and some didn't. And it's the old Tory story, because this is the third time they have abolished a separate development department and said, right, you get back inside the Foreign Office where you belong. And I think this is a profound mistake. And when the Prime Minister got up in the House of Commons and referred to DFID as some giant cash point in the sky, it told me, well, I knew it anyway, he understood nothing about what Britain has done and does, and the difference that our development work makes to people we haven't met, but girls and children in school, and made sure that other children don't die of diseases that our children don't die of. And it's the thinking behind it that showed he doesn't understand it.
Just the final thing when around the internal market bill, I suppose, that we have to talk about briefly, which is, what do you think its implications are for the future of devolution, and particularly for the future of Scotland?
Well, we have an internal market in the United Kingdom, and of course that has been governed by our membership of the European Union thus far. I can see the point. If you are negotiating a new trade deal as the United Kingdom, it's a bit tricky to say 3/4 of the way through, by the way, you know, we've been talking about these products and those products. Did we happen to mention that they won't be able to get into certain parts of the United Kingdom because there are different policies being followed? Now, it depends on the nature of those policies, but there is a way forward on this that doesn't involve doing what the government's done in the bill. And this was the second reason that we, as the Labour opposition, voted against it. Everybody agreed we need to sit down and talk about how we're going to handle certain questions. And the concept of common frameworks came into being. And on many of those, agreement has been reached. And the way to deal with this is through common frameworks and putting them into legislation, rather than saying, oi, excuse me, we're taking the power and we're going to impose them on you. The second question is about the future of the United Kingdom. And we have asymmetric, in that horrible jargon, devolution, considerable devolution in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. England remains a very centralised country. That's why I've long campaigned for devolution to our cities and our regions on a flexible basis, because I don't think there's a single model. I'm very much against ministers drawing lines on a map and saying we're devolving to that, because the economic and political geography of areas differs. And there is an argument to consider for whether we should eventually move to some kind of formal federal structure. In which you would replace the House of Lords with a Senate, a second chamber that dealt with explicitly federal questions. Now, I don't know how that is going to be resolved, but having said all of that, I am very much against another Scottish independence referendum, and I'm very much against independence breaking up the United Kingdom, because I think we have been a successful union. And going back to the question you just asked me, in the modern world, the strength of our relationships with those who are nearest and dearest are what gives us influence and security in the world. And as the global financial crisis of over a decade showed, it was the strength of the Treasury and the action of Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown that helped to rescue banks in Scotland. And I don't know how they would have done that if Scotland had been an independent country at that time.
You're opposed to Scottish independence, but
yeah,
would you really oppose a Scottish referendum, even if in the elections next May, the SNP got a very, very clear and unambiguous mandate? That's to say, they stood on a platform of wanting a referendum, and they won a majority in a system that was specifically designed not to provide majorities, but they won a majority for that.
No, I would not be in favour of it, because I think it would be very divisive. Now, I know those in favour of independence will be shouting at the screen at this point. As far as I can tell from the polling evidence in Scotland, this is not a priority for the Scottish people. And thirdly, we were told this was a once-in-a-generation decision. Well, I haven't seen a generation pass since then. Now, the argument goes that circumstances have changed with the Brexit referendum result, but the fact that the previous referendum went against independence meant we were one United Kingdom, and whether we like it or we don't like it, the votes were counted on the basis of a single country, the United Kingdom. And all of us who voted Remain, well, we lost and we're unhappy about it, but that was the outcome.
But many of those who voted Remain and lost came to call for another referendum.
Yep, that's
many
true.
of those same people are now saying to the Scots, we've decided this, it was a once in a generation decision, you can't have another referendum. Is there a danger that Labour opponents of this who call for a second EU referendum might be seen as hypocritical?
I think that is a fair point. What we were seeking to do in asking for a second referendum was on the terms on which we leave. It goes right back to your original question, and because the first referendum didn't sort that out. And therefore, this is what leaving now means. And you voted leave, you vote for that. That's the end of the story. But at this point, if on balance you think that's not what you thought you were voting for, then you have an opportunity to change your mind and say, no, I'd rather stay with the arrangement we've got at the moment. And I do think that that is a different set of circumstances to rerunning exactly the same issue in the same referendum in Scotland. That's the difference between the two.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about the Labour Party?
Sure.
We start with a slightly cheeky question, for which I apologise in advance, which is, has it ever crossed your mind to leave the Labour Party?
No.
Okay, that was easy. Once Brexit, I mean, who knows if this will happen, once Brexit has gone as an issue, do you think that many of the problems Labour experience in its traditional heartlands will simply melt away, or is that problem far more fundamental than simply Brexit and getting it done?
Well, I think there were, if I think back to November and December last year, and like all candidates, all that door knocking and walking in the pouring rain, I think there were three things that came across. One indeed was Brexit, but remember, we lost votes from people who had supported Brexit. We also lost votes from people who had voted Remain. So I don't accept the argument that if we'd come out and said, right, we accept Brexit, that's it, it's all over, that somehow we would have won. That's the first point. Secondly was we promised so many things that we failed Nye Bevan's famous test when he said socialism is the language of priorities. And it didn't look like we were prioritizing. And as a result, people thought, well, that's all very good. Free broadband, paying the WASPy women everything they've lost, but they didn't think it was credible. And thirdly, I had too many conversations on too many doorsteps where people said, I've always voted Labour, but. Mm-hmm. And they didn't think that our leadership was credible, and that's why we had the worst results since 1932. So Brexit was clearly part of it, but in the end you win if you can gain the public's trust and confidence. Policy is of course important, and that's why I think Keir Starmer has been absolutely right to focus his efforts since his election victory, and it was considerable, to say this is a new approach, and I want to win your trust and confidence in me as the leader and in the party. And I think that's what we need to do, a stage at a time, because it's a long haul back from the scale of that defeat.
There's been a lot of talk, I mean, around Brexit, sort of linked to the question I just asked you, that this isn't simply an issue of Brexit, it's a question of values, that values, social liberalism versus social conservatism, if you like, is the new divide in British politics. And that explains why some of those traditional Labour heartlands where people aren't conservative in terms of their economic values, turn to the Conservatives. Firstly, do you think that's true? And secondly, do you have ideas as to how Labour can win or address that values battle? Because it strikes me that one of the problems that Labour has is that many of its MPs are far more socially liberal than the constituents they're trying to win back from the Conservatives at the next election.
Well, that is a very important question, and I think that is part of it. But I also think that communities that have felt left behind by change, the disappearance of the old industries, have thought, well, we're worse off than we were. We used to have well-paid jobs. Now you have to do 2 or 3 jobs to earn the same amount of money. It's in a call center or warehouse or whatever it is. And I think in retrospect, we should have been much more active in trying to assist communities like that, but being open to foreign investment has helped in some places. I also think better transport infrastructure matters, because if jobs are being created in some places and not others, helping people to get to the jobs is a very practical contribution to enabling people to get a better job and a better income. I think there's certain basics, standing up for the country, and the Skripal poisoning has been cited by many people as a for instance, because it's really quite basic. And it's really quite basic when you know the history of Russia killing people on British soil, which happened with Mr. Litvinenko. I mean, the forensic evidence could not have been clearer. And I think that that is a problem supporting our armed forces. But the British people, in my experience, are where the balance between social conservatism and social liberalism sits changes over time. It really does. And if you look at attitudes towards gay people, there's been a transformation in my lifetime, and that is a good thing. And I think if you get the basics right, then it's much easier to advance other policies that not everyone may necessarily agree with. But if people feel alienated on a number of different fronts, then you've got a problem.
It seems, for the moment at least, that the Labour leadership have decided to talk a lot about patriotism and very little about policy. Is that the right approach, and how long is that going to be sustainable for?
Well, as Keir said in his interview on Mar last Sunday, there's plenty of time because the next election is quite a way away, and things are changing in ways that we couldn't have anticipated. Now, take the COVID crisis. Sadly, we're going to see unemployment rising throughout the autumn as businesses that were sustainable are no longer sustainable until such time as we get a vaccine and we can return to life not in fear of the virus. But there are also great opportunities. In this sense, how do we create new jobs in new industries and new sectors? And this is the time to seize them, because through that you can provide jobs for people who've lost the job that they had before. And here I would absolutely cite the climate crisis, because if we're going to meet our target, then we have to take a number of practical steps. Example, 18 million or so homes rely on gas for cooking or heating. We're not going to be able to meet our zero carbon target if that continues to be the case with a gas boiler or a gas cooker. So how are we going to convert? Is it going to be electricity? Is it going to be hydrogen? Are we going to be making the new boilers here in the United Kingdom and creating jobs? We'll certainly create jobs for the fitters who go out and install them, but we have to have a way of paying for it that doesn't fall on my constituents, because I have too many constituents who can barely afford the gas bill, and they certainly can't afford to replace the boiler. Now, there is a practical challenge. Meet an objective that we've set, because we know dangerous climate change will affect everybody. Now is the time for a policy to train people up, to invest in an industrial strategy that makes sure we're making those green products of the future, provide training and skills, and get the investment in. Now, that's what I would be talking about, along with many other things.
I mean, one final question on this, and I suppose on your part of the world, or my part of the world more than yours, so sort of West Yorkshire, not Leeds, is, in the last election, one of the things, the senses I got from people was there's partly been a sort of an erosion of trust in Labour, because Labour have been there, they've been empowering those seats for a long, long time. It was almost smelt a little bit like the reaction against Labour that you got in Scotland. Do you think there is a trust problem for Labour now, for having not sort of addressed the problems of these communities effectively for so long? And do you think it's possible to win those communities back over?
Well, Brexit, as I said earlier, was certainly part of it. And look, we need to be proud of so many things that previous Labour governments have done, including the government in which I served. And it's a fundamental truth. If we in the Labour Party, those of us in the Labour Party, are not proud of what Labour governments have done, how on earth are you going to persuade anyone else to vote for one again in the future? So we mustn't ignore and disparage the past. That's a really, I think, basic and essential message. But we are full of awareness of the things that aren't right and the things that need to be fixed. I think the experience of a Conservative government is already coming as quite of a disappointment to people, because Boris Johnson set a very high bar and he's not doing very well, is he, in actually meeting it. But I think it's going to take time. And the starting point has to be a recognition of the nature of the problem. And then the party needs to work together in a united way to fix it. And I hope we can also leave behind the divisions of the last 4 years, which didn't do anybody any good at all. At which point some people will say, well, you and other MPs played their part. But I would just point out the argument we made was that we weren't confident that we were going to win under the leader that the party had chosen. And I recognise that Jeremy had a big democratic mandate, and I recognise and applaud him for the number of new members that he brought into the party. But all of the policy that we developed is nothing if we don't get the chance to implement it. And I very much support someone who said recently we need to spend more time talking to people whose support we need, rather than talking to those in the party who are already Labour supporters. That's not to undervalue the importance of Labour Party members, because they're fundamental to developing new policy ideas, to walking the streets when we can after the end of COVID. Absolutely important, but we have to be able to win.
Okay, I almost forgot. I was going to give you a little bit of a chance to blow your own trumpet, actually, before well, I thought I'd do it out of kindness. How effective do you think your Brexit committee has been in holding the government to account over the last 4 years?
Honestly, Anand, I think that is for others. No, I'm not going to blow any trumpet, even if I had one. No, I think we've tried hard to ask the questions that are needed of the government. It isn't always possible to get the answers that you want. But it's very important that we do scrutinise what the government is up to. And I hope that Parliament will find a way of continuing to scrutinise relations with the European Union after the end of the year, because I think negotiations on a number of things are going to continue. But our select committee system is very important, and it's built its strength and influence over the years. And when you think back to Michael Foot, for whom I have enormous respect, but wasn't terribly keen on select committees because he believed in the primacy of the chamber in holding ministers to account, we've come to realise that actually select committees can be really, really effective. And I've seen policies change just because a select committee invited a particular individual to come and give evidence. And they sat there and thought, blimey, how am I going to answer that question? Well, that's not a very good answer. I'm now going to announce I'm going to do things differently. And that is the power of accountability, even when you're in opposition. And that's the other thing to remember about Labour in Parliament. We can bring about change by holding the government to account.
And I have to say, as a frustrated observer, the counterpart of that is that under this government in particular, the chamber has come to seem less and less satisfactory, just because of the way questions aren't answered and the way the government...
Sure, it's very different from the previous 2.5 years, because the government didn't have a majority, and Parliament was at the absolute centre. And if you wanted anything to go through, you had to win a majority in Parliament.
I'm just going to break you off because we're running out of time. I want to ask you one final question, which I think is worth asking, which is the Labour charge against this government is primarily one of incompetence. Can you, in the sort of minute we have left, just talk to us about those areas where you think this government has failed and where a more organised and more competent government could and should have done better?
Well, coronavirus, failing to lock down earlier, not ensuring that we had enough PPE. Well, there's another new industry. Come on, we are the 6th richest economy in the world. Are you seriously telling me we're not capable of manufacturing enough PPE for virus outbreaks? The testing system has been a terrible mess. The exam U-turn, seriously, it was obvious the moment the results came out in Scotland, and the Scottish government moved in about a day to say we'll go back to teacher predicted grades. The government held on and finally had to give in. Well, that is not a competent and effective government at all. And the other thing I would mention is, where is this social care green paper that the Tories have been promising for yonks? because as coronavirus has demonstrated, but we know anyway, we haven't got a national NHS and care service. And, you know, one of the other challenges is today I break my leg, tomorrow I am depressed, the day after that I am old. I'm the same person, and we should have a system that cares for each of us according to our needs at the time we have them. And if I broke my leg today and went into A&E and they said, yep, you bust your leg, is a 9-week wait to have a cast put on, we'd say, what on earth are you on about? But if you go to your doctor and say you're depressed, there may be a 9-week wait or longer to get mental health support. That isn't good enough. And that comes from our values as a party, which Keir spoke about. We want to leave behind a better country and a better world and a better society when our time is done. And that time will come soon enough. And the Labour Party has a really proud history of having done a great deal to make this a better country, and progress encourages us to do more. And I am an optimist, because how on earth do you get up in the morning if you don't believe in the possibility of change for the better? And that's what brought me into the Labour Party and hundreds of thousands of other people. And what a wonderful group of folk it is.
Well, that strikes me as a very positive and good note on which to end. Hilary, thank you so much for taking your time. Thank you to everyone who has joined us virtually. I do hope one day we can meet again in person and maybe do this over a glass of wine with an audience in front of us. But for the moment, Hilary, thank you ever so much. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Cheers.
Well, thank you, Anand. I enjoyed it enormously. Cheery bye.
This is the moment we wait and see if we get logged off or we log off ourselves, or
is that what's known as a wrap?
People a lot younger than me say that.
Well, I didn't get a chance to see whether there are any comments, but I was just scrolling through.
Most of them say it was fantastically chaired.
Yeah, but shame about the answers, but great sharing.
Okay. All right, I think we are meant to log off ourselves, so I will do so.
All
but
right.
Hilary, thanks. And
it's an absolute. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have been interrogated by. It was great. No, I really did enjoy it. I did, and I hope everything's going okay with you and the family. All right.
Yeah.
You
thank
take
you.
care. All the best. See you soon. Bye.